Good morning and welcome to this week's edition of History Comes Alive. Today we're embarked on our second program of a series of 3 on the world of ancient Greece, why it still matters today. Our focus today is on the classical age of Greece. If you have your handouts in front of you, that's the area highlighted in gold there at the bottom. About a 150-year period when ancient Greece achieved its greatest prosperity, cultural achievements, science, philosophy, literature, and the arts. Of course, exemplified in the great Parthenon temple to Athena, the goddess of wisdom and the protector of ancient Athens. Now, before I get started on today's program, I want to talk about our homework assignments. I did have some feedback from a couple folks. First off, Mark and Joanne Anderson informed me that within minutes of the end of last week's program, they were on Channel 4 here at Willow Valley and saw in the news of the day that Serena Williams had withdrawn from the French Open due to an Achilles heel injury. And of course, now you know whence the term Achilles heel came from. And had a fascinating email from Dave Baker here at Willow Valley, an avid stamp collector or philatelist, a term, by the way, taken from the Greek. He informed me and sent me some samples of a series of UN postage stamps from 2004 commemorating World Heritage Sites, of which there are many in Greece. Shown here are 2 of them, 2 of the stamps, and the photographs show the Temple of the Oracle at Delphi on the left, and of course there's that Parthenon again atop the Acropolis in Athens. So thank you to both the Andersons and to Dave Baker for those contributions. And I wanted to let you know I did my own homework as well, and I wanted to pull down this brief TV commercial. It's a spoof on ancient Greece. The company presenting the commercial is Auto Trader. I don't know much about them, but this certainly caught my eye. So here, let's watch this reenactment of ancient Greece. I don't know why they chose 873 BC for the source. I mean, that's well before any written records of ancient Greece other than the poems of Homer. So anyway, here we go with this recent TV commercial.
Still driving the old model, huh?
Yeah, I've been looking, but I just need someone to tell me what a good price is.
Just use Auto Trader. It's the only one with Kelley Blue Book. It tells you if the price is good.
Hey, how's she doing that with the door? What is she, some sort of goddess?
Athena.
Persephone?
Hera.
Dionysus?
No, I'm Claire.
That one?
No clue.
Ugh.
Well, there you have a previously unknown ancient Greek deity, the goddess Claire. Anyway, let's move on for our program today from the ridiculous to the sublime. This image, a later illustration, of course, shows the city of Athens at its height. And there's the Parthenon again. And by the way, I'll talk about this statue up here briefly. Of course, it's no longer there, fell down in ancient times. Well, Athens was by far the largest Greek city-state, had a population of 200,000 to 300,000 at its height, and is also the city that's most well represented by far in the historical record. So Athens always stands out as a dominant symbol of the classical age in Greece. One of the most noted features of Athens and nearly all Greek cities was a unique style of government that came to be known as democracy, or rule by the people in Greek, the demos. And you can see from the illustration here who the demos were. Who were the people? They were men. Although free women were considered citizens, only free adult males had the right to vote and hold political office. Democracy evolved over several centuries. One early progenitor was the legendary Athenian statesman Solon, shown here on the left, lived around 600 BC. He freed poor debtors from slavery, gave the common people a voice in political decision-making, and over the next 100 years, the workings of the Athenian government evolved, eventually included the right to equality before the law on the part of all Greek citizens. And so we can say that by about 500 BC, Athenian democracy took the form in which we know it today. The main body of government in ancient Greece was the assembly, hypothetically involving all citizens, although not all took an active part all at the same time. About 6,000 at a time could get together in the open air on the Pnyx, shown here, this hillside above the city. And you can see again in the background here is the Acropolis with the Parthenon on top. The assembly passed laws in ancient Greece, voted on diplomatic policy, military strategy, elected the generals and the senior government officials. The agenda for the assembly was set by a council of 500 citizens drawn by lot for one-year terms to avoid any hint of corruption. And the members of the council were paid, like jurors today, so that all levels of society could take part. It's interesting, if you chose not to be involved in politics, if you avoided public service, you might be called among the idiotes, from which we get the term idiot. So imagine in ancient Greece, the idiots were those who were not in politics. The best preserved council hall, by the way, is up here in the left, top left. I showed this to you in our program on Western Turkey. This is in Priene in Turkey, and it shows the extent to which the political ideals of Athens spread throughout the Greek world. An interesting angle about Greek democracy is that each year the citizens could vote on anyone who might be a threat to democracy. And the penalty was 10 years of exile out of the city. And the citizens voted by writing that individual's name on a shard of pottery called an ostrakon. If you got a majority vote in the assembly, you were out, a process known as ostracism, another one of those fabulous Greek loan words. Well, democracy in Athens, especially a freewheeling process, participatory process, placed a big premium on discussion and debate. Outside the assembly, much of this took place in the agora, or the marketplace, which was not just a place for buying and selling, but a marketplace for ideas. Leaders, would-be leaders, and ordinary citizens took to these public spaces to argue over the great political issues of the day. As a result, one of the most important skills that men cultivated in ancient Greece was rhetoric, the art of persuasive speaking. If you weren't the slickest orator in town, you could hire a sophist, a kind of professor of rhetoric. These itinerant teachers eventually gained a bad reputation for charging high fees, promoting deceptive reasoning, and even selling canned speeches. I guess a modern-day analog would be the political media consultant. The notion of democracy had an impact on how the Greeks waged war. Instead of a paid professional army, most Greek city-states relied on ordinary citizens called up as a militia in times of crisis. And most of them served as hoplites, shown here, lightly armored infantry armed with spears and round shields. They fought shoulder to shoulder in a tightly packed formation known as a phalanx. Battles were close and violent, but brief, only an hour or two. The spirit of Athenian warriors was captured in an epitaph, uncovered at the site of a great victory over Persian invaders, of whom I'll talk in a few minutes. The epitaph read as follows: "If dying nobly is the greatest part of valor, to us, above all others, fortune has granted this, for after striving to crown Greece with freedom, we lie here enjoying praise that will never age." And so there you have, again, that notion I talked about last week of the Greeks gaining immortality, not through any religious intervention, but through their own deeds of heroism and courage. Last week, I also mentioned the economic situation in Greece, economic inequality despite political equality. When the upper crust were not fighting in ancient Greece or making speeches, how did they occupy their time? Well, one common form of recreation was the symposium. Think of it as a cocktail party with benefits. Combined serious discussion on philosophy, politics, with slave girls, known as heterae or companions, to provide entertainment, musical entertainment or otherwise. The convivial atmosphere was enhanced with wine, not only drinking it, but shown here is something called a kotobos. The Greeks would entertain themselves by throwing the dregs of their wine cup against a target on the wall. Pretty exciting times if you're a young man in an ancient Greek symposium. These events often included or incorporated homosexual relations between young men and older mentors as a kind of rite of passage into full maturity. There was no particular stigma attached to same-sex relations in ancient Greece. In fact, men were expected to enjoy all sorts of sexual experiences before they settled down in their 30s to raise a family. The only thing prohibited was sex with a married woman who was someone else's wife. What about women in Greek society? Their ideal role was to serve as wife and mother, bearing and raising legitimate children, managing the household, carrying out the typical domestic chores like cooking, spinning, and weaving. Women were seen as biologically inferior to men, impulsive, even dangerous. The Greek word for uterus was hystera, and it was felt that involuntary movements of the uterus would cause anxiety, emotional excess, giving rise to the term hysteria. Unwanted movements of the uterus. Wealthy women, like the one on the right, had slaves, and there's a slave shown. It looks like she's holding up a laptop computer. I'm sure it's a mirror and a makeup case. Slaves would tend to their personal needs. They rarely left home, except to mourn at funerals. And when they did leave the home, they would apply white lead-based makeup to keep that pale indoor look. They were also expected to cover their hair, as you can see on the statue at the left, and to proceed in public in respectable silence. And as I said before, women had no place in the political system. They could own property, but they had to have a man represent them in judicial proceedings. Poor women, of course, had to go out in public. They often helped their husbands in the fields or worked in the markets, peddling trinkets, bread, or produce. One city-state had a very different conception of women and society generally. That was Sparta. Women in Sparta were expected to raise not heirs, but warriors. This fascinating statuette on the left shows a young Spartan girl in a short skirt conducting some form of physical training. This was imposed on Spartan girls so they could mature and give birth to healthy boys. And it suggests a relative degree of freedom that women enjoyed in Sparta. Boys, on the other hand, were taken from their family at age 7 for a life of military drill and discipline under what one could call Spartan conditions. They were confined to the barracks until age 30. They were allowed out only at night, periodically, for sex with their wives. They endured cold baths, flogging, forced silence. The word laconic, meaning terse, comes from Laconia, a region of Greece that embodied the capital of Sparta. Spartan young men in military training were even encouraged to steal food to augment their meager diet. There's an amazing story preserved of a young boy, a teenager, I believe, hiding a stolen fox under his cloak. The fox gets loose under there and chews his abdomen, and he dies rather than revealing this stolen food under his cloak. Well, the reason for this enforced discipline in Sparta was that Sparta was a highly militarized state. Early in its history, Sparta conquered a lot of the hinterland around the city, and to support the economy, the inhabitants were forced into permanent slavery. They were known as helots, shown there on the left. Obviously, if you're maintaining a large slave population, there's a constant threat of revolt. And so the helots were brutally repressed. In fact, once a year, Spartan youth were able to enjoy an open season on helots, killing them for sport. This constant focus on military readiness made Sparta virtually an armed camp. And the government of Sparta was different from most Greek cities as well. It was ruled by kings, two kings in fact, from two ancient dynasties. One of the most famous was King Leonidas, shown here in a statue. We'll talk about him when we get to a discussion of the great battle at Thermopylae. Instead of a popular assembly in Sparta, laws were crafted by a small group of elders. So government in Sparta could be described not as a democracy, but an oligarchy. The Spartans had little concern for politics or other peaceful pursuits, but they were fierce fighters. Cowards in battle were shunned for the rest of their lives. The aim is victory or a glorious death. A Spartan mother, as her son was going off to battle, would say, "Return home with your shield or on it." Well, Sparta was sporadically a rival of Athens, but one state was the enemy of all Greeks, and that was Persia. Around 500 BC, Persia had the largest empire in history up until that point in time, stretched from India to Egypt, as you can see on the map. And this vast wealth was supported by a huge professional army, some of whom are shown up there on the right. In Western Turkey, here in Ionia, the Persians installed tyrants to rule over the population, which consisted mostly of Greeks who had settled there in the preceding centuries. In 499 BC, the Greeks in Ionia revolted. Athens sends help, but is defeated in this early clash. King Darius of Persia vows to avenge the obstreperous Greeks. In fact, he orders his servant to tell him 3 times a day before dinner, "Remember the Athenians." In 490, Darius, the emperor, sent a punitive expedition to Greece. They land at the plain of Marathon. Athens sends a courier by the name of Phidippides, shown on the right, sends him racing 150 miles to Sparta, asking for help. But the Spartans decline to join the fray. They're in the middle of a religious festival, and they didn't want to offend the gods, so Phidippides runs another 150 miles back to Athens with the bad news. So Athens is left essentially on its own. Athens marshals a force of 10,000 hoplites. They face off against 25,000 Persians. Although they're outnumbered, they trounce the Persian invaders. And Phidippides, who already has got to be pretty tired, he's called into service again. This time he runs 25 miles from Athens to Marathon. Then he runs another 25 miles back to Athens, and he announces to the citizens of Athens, as depicted in the painting, "We are victorious." Then he collapses and dies. When the Olympics were revived in 1896, this story inspired the Greeks to set their long-distance foot race, known as the marathon, at 25 miles. This was changed to about 26 miles in 1908, when the Olympics were held in England. This was the distance from Windsor Castle, where the king could see the runners off, to the stadium in London. After Darius dies, his son Xerxes, shown on the right, inherited his grudge against the Athenians, and this triggers round 2 of the Persian Wars. In 480 BC, Xerxes sent a huge army and fleet to Greece. They crossed from Asia into Europe on the pontoon bridge, shown there in the painting, called a bridge of boats over the Hellespont. The army was so large it took 7 days and nights to cross over into mainland Europe. In Greece, the Persians were met by a coalition of 31 city-states, now including both Athens and Sparta. At a mountain pass at Thermopylae, 3,000 Greeks rally to block the advance of 200,000 Persians. The legendary 300 of Sparta, part of this blocking force, make a desperate stand. The image there is from the 2006 action movie, The 300. I didn't see it. It's pretty lurid. It's got a lot of computer enhanced muscle men in it. But there you are, the Spartans, the 300, joining their fellow Greeks to hold off the Persian advance. The story is told that when the Spartans learned there were so many archers on the Persian side that their arrows would block the sun, a Spartan, typically laconic, says, "Excellent news, we will get to fight in the shade." Well, they're all killed, but their sacrifice buys time. So the Greeks can escape to fight another day because they have another strategy up their sleeve to build a great naval fleet. Those ships are known as triremes, one of the most potent weapons in the ancient world. They have a crew of 200, including 170 oarsmen in 3 tiers, whence the term trireme comes from. And the metal ram in front makes them ship-sized torpedoes, sort of like ancient cruise missiles. In all, about 300 Greek triremes meet the Persian fleet, which was 2 or 3 times the size, in a narrow strait off the island of Salamis. In the Battle of Salamis, 480 BC, the first major naval battle in history. The smaller, more maneuverable Greek ships devastate the Persian fleet. And the following year, on land, the Greek coalition routs the Persian infantry and send them packing as well, back to Persia. This stunning victory over the greatest empire of the era is seen as a decisive moment in history. The free men of Greece have united to defend the civilized world against the tyrannical barbarians from the east. And it gives Athens, in particular, an opportunity to create an ideal state. And we see that embodied in Athens during the mid-5th century BC, the height of Greek civilization. The era is really dominated politically by the great statesman Pericles, who lived exactly in the middle of the 5th century BC, a great populist, enhanced democracy for ordinary Athenians. And I had sent you last week the funeral oration of Pericles, as recounted by a contemporary Greek historian, Thucydides. And in that oration, Pericles is reported as paying tribute to Athenians who died in the opening battles of the Peloponnesian Wars, which I'll get to in a minute. He compares the generous, creative spirit of Athens to the militaristic oligarchy of Sparta. One of his noted quotes in that address the power is in the hands of the whole people. That's his definition of democracy. Everyone is equal before the law. And Pericles makes another statement, it's worth quoting. It really speaks to this notion of what Greek democracy meant. Pericles, in that funeral oration, said, "We do not say that a man who takes no interest in politics is a man who minds his own business. We say that he has no business here at all." As a symbol of Athenian greatness, Pericles directed the building of the Parthenon, a great marble temple to Athena atop the Acropolis. Stonemasons from all over Greece toiled for 15 years to build it. And this painting is wonderful because it shows the original color. The original color on the Parthenon. We often have an impression that ancient Greek sculpture and architecture was pristine white. It sort of ties into our notion of Greek ideals. In fact, it was brightly painted, often garishly painted, and traces of those pigments remain on a few pieces of statuary. Over here on the left of the Parthenon is a great bronze statue made from weapons seized and melted down from the Persians. It's a statue of Athena, and on the inside, shown here on the left, was another statue of Athena, the patron goddess of the city. 42 feet tall, made of gold and ivory. There's a man down at the bottom for scale. And I should point out, this is not a digital recreation. This is a real photograph, an actual photograph of a life-size replica of Athena and the Parthenon itself, which was built in Nashville, Tennessee, of all places, in 1897. Athens of the South was how Nashville described itself back then, and the Parthenon, the faux Parthenon, was built to commemorate the 100th anniversary of Tennessee statehood. Of course, Athena is not only the goddess of wisdom, also the goddess of warfare, and you'll notice here on her right hand, she's holding the winged goddess of victory, Nike, whose name comes down to us today, pronounced Nike, those expensive shoes that will give you victory on the fields of athletic strife. Well, the Parthenon is not the only tangible legacy of Greek civilization. I'll talk more about that next week in general terms. But most importantly for today's discussion, the Greeks introduced the idea of naturalism to Western art and sculpture. The ancient Greeks admired the beauty of the human form, and this really flourishes during the Renaissance. Again, we'll discuss next week how the Renaissance revived this notion of artistic excellence. And I put these images up here to show a very important transition. So on the left are two sculptures of youths from the pre-classical era. On the far left is a traditional Egyptian statuette. It's from Greece, but it's in the Egyptian style, since the Greeks did have all sorts of intercourse with the other states around the Mediterranean. So you'll notice the statue has a very stiff look. The youth is looking straight ahead, arms at the sides. The feet are in that traditional Egyptian statuary pose. Then in the middle is a statue from about 600 BC in Greece called a kouros, a statue of a young man. Very much imitates the Egyptian style, and again, he's looking straight ahead. But look what happens 150 years later. The height of the classical era, this famous discus thrower. This is actually a marble copy of the bronze original in the Greek, captures energy and movement based on a very careful study of anatomy. Maybe it's a little bit too perfect. The discus thrower has a very calm expression, very idealized. But really, this is an iconic representation of the Greeks and their love of the human form. The Greeks invented classical drama, another art form to which we are indebted. Drama in ancient Greece was an outgrowth of religious festivals. The theater of Dionysus below the Acropolis, it's shown here in this contemporary illustration, contemporary to our time. This was the first purpose-built theater in the world, and the image shows how it might have looked. There was raised seating for about 10,000 spectators, and that's twice the number of people who could be accommodated in the assembly on the Pnyx, which shows how important theater was in the cultural life of the city. The background, this huge structure on the right, was called a skene, from which we get the term scene. Well, there wasn't much scenery involved in ancient Greek drama, but they did have a crane that could reach out from behind the skene, over the top, and drop gods down into the action if it was necessary to move things along. The pit, the space in front of the skene, right here, was known as the orchestra. This is a performance space where the chorus danced and sang, from which, of course, we get not only the word orchestra as a musical collective, but also the orchestra seats down in that position in a modern-day theater. On stage, 3 men played all the parts, including the women's parts. In fact, women could not attend the theater in ancient Greece. And they had in their masks, shown here are some theatrical masks from a fresco at Pompeii. The masks had sort of a built-in megaphone so they could project their voices to the far corners of the theater. Greek plays were presented in competitions. You remember I talked last week about this notion of agon or strife, competition. Playwrights could win prizes for their creative genius, just as athletes could win prizes for athletic prowess. Plays were funded with public support. Pericles himself paid for the first known production of a Greek drama by Aeschylus. And Aeschylus and his fellow playwrights explored moral and ethical issues facing the community. The themes and characters of ancient Greek drama still inspire playwrights, movie makers, opera composers today. I'll give an example of that next week. There were 2 main forms of theater in ancient Greece. Again, on the left is a mask of drama. Dramas were typically set in the past, offered solemn lessons on the suffering and downfall that great men can experience, like Oedipus the king. Suffering from pride, ignorance, or just the fickle workings of fate. Comedy mask is on the right. Comedy offered, by contrast, scathing comments on current events. Personalities in Greek comedies, the leaders were frequently insulted. They were full of satire, profanity, sex on stage. Sadly, most Greek plays have been lost to history. Only 32 survive in more or less complete form. This is less than 10% of the Greek plays that we know from other documentary evidence were actually written. Greek plays incorporated music and poetry. Poetry was often referred to as lyric poetry after the lyre, shown here on the right, the harp-like stringed instrument that accompanied the music. We don't know much about the music of ancient Greek drama. We know there were 7 modes. Scholars have been trying to figure out exactly what they were. We have names for them, but we don't know much more other than the fact that they had profound emotional effects on the audience. Musicologists have discovered some fragments, papyrus fragments with a form of musical notation on it, and they've been able to plausibly reconstruct the sound of ancient Greek music. So I'm going to play a very short excerpt, mercifully short if you don't like this sort of thing, an excerpt from a choral ode from a play by Euripides called Orestes, written in 408 BC. And the lyric, since you won't understand the Greek, I lament because of your mother's blood that drives you mad. So listen to this very brief excerpt of music as it might have sounded in the theater of ancient Greece. The singer or chanter in this excerpt is accompanied by the aulos, double reed instrument shown here. The name is often mistranslated flute. So I hope that music for a few seconds took you back to an ancient time, in some ways weirdly different from today's world, but also, if you think about the grand scope of what the Greeks contributed to society, strikingly familiar. I'm going to end with a crucial event to kind of bring the great classical age of Greece to a close, the Peloponnesian Wars. This was a series of sporadic battles between the Greek city-states beginning in 431 BC. The wars started when Athens and Sparta formed competing alliances on the mainland, on the Greek islands, and also out here on the Ionian coast of present-day Turkey. A contemporary witness of these wars, Thucydides, who wrote the funeral oration or recounted the funeral oration in the document we looked at earlier, Thucydides said, I quote, "Practically the whole Greek world was convulsed with rival parties in every state. Fanatical enthusiasm was the mark of a real man. Society became divided into camps in which no man trusted his fellow." Again, this is an echo of contemporary politics today, perhaps. Anyway, like a hero of Greek tragedy, the Athenian leader Pericles became obsessed with dreams of glory. He wanted to make Athens the undisputed ruler of the Mediterranean world, and he led his people down a path of empire building. Allies of Athens were forced to submit to the status of vassals. Athens imposed huge taxes on these vassals, crushed any attempts to break free. Factional fighting spreads as far as Sicily. And in time, Persia, of all people, comes in on the side of the Spartans. They blockade Athens. A plague breaks out in the city. Pericles himself dies of the plague. And Sparta and Persia starve Athens into surrender. Then, a few years later, Athens recovers, then joins with Persia. Now Athens is allied with Persia, and they face another major power, the city-state of Thebes. And in the end, Thebes defeats both Athens and Sparta, as well as the Persians. And as a result of these decades of conflict, Greek society is left impoverished and exhausted. And so, as a result of the Peloponnesian Wars, I believe the very idea of democracy is discredited. Critics of the time felt that it led to mob rule, imperial aggression, political decline. And so democracy is really not revived in the West for another 2,000 years. And I have to say, contributing to the eventual reappearance of democracy as we know it today probably owes a little bit less to ancient Greece than it does to factors such as the restrictions placed in the English-speaking world on the rights of kings, beginning with Magna Carta in the 1200s. Enlightenment ideas contributed to the reemergence of democracy, as did in America and in Western Europe, the Protestant Reformation. I think the notion that all are equal in the sight of God, again, provided an impetus to what became, as we know it in America, democracy, a representative democracy. Not a pure democracy as in ancient Athens, which I think is probably practiced only in the town meetings up in villages in New England, where everybody has a chance to participate, speak their mind. But nevertheless, ancient Greece certainly provided the impetus for people of the West to think about this radically different notion, rule of the people, the demos. So that concludes my second program in this series. Next week, the third and final session on the world of ancient Greece. We're going to pick up the story after the Peloponnesian Wars. We'll talk about Alexander the Great, a Macedonian-related ethnic culture to the north of Greece, whose army carried Greek culture as far afield as India. Later, after Alexander, the Byzantine Empire took over from the Roman capital in Rome, preserved many Greek traditions. But Greece itself, the territory that we know today as Greece, fell to domination by the Ottoman Turks, did not gain its independence until 1830. So it's in the early 19th century that we finally, for the first time actually, have a political state, a unified nation called Greece. And the program next week, we're going to conclude with a fairly exhaustive survey, if that's not a contradiction in terms, of perhaps our greatest legacy from ancient Greece. More so even than perhaps democracy, the idea of philosophy, the love of wisdom. And I'll end by talking quite a bit about Socrates, who, although we don't know much about what he thought personally, he left no writings of his own, we do know that he asked us to question everything in a relentless search for truth, justice, and happiness, ideas that will stand us in good stead even today. So for those of you who are on my regular distribution list, you will get tomorrow some additional reading material for your edification, an excerpt from Plato's famous allegory of the cave. And we'll discuss that and the remaining aspects of the Greek legacy next week. And now I'm going to look and see if we have any questions from our faithful audience. So if you do have questions, ideas come to mind, some other observations, or if you want to take another stab at doing your homework, looking for traces of Greek culture in the modern world, happy to get those. Just email them to me. And otherwise, we will see you same time next week.